All right, perfect. Like I said, thank you so much for joining us for our first webinar of 2022. We are very excited to have Dr. Kim Duffy here as our host, our Vicon Senior Life Sciences Product Manager, and Dr. James Shippen, the BoB Biomechanics founder. So we'll be hearing about an introduction to BoB teaching, and we'll also have some time for questions at the end. The Q&A section is open in here, so I will be watching that as it goes. If you have any other questions, you can pop those in the channel. If you would like to see our previous sessions, we have about 22, 23 webinars we've done over the past year, and those are all available on our YouTube channel. This recording will be sent to you in 24 hours and anyone who registered for the session. And then we also have it available on YouTube. Make sure to follow our social channels to find out about upcoming sessions. Our next webinar is February 16th. With an introduction to the Contemplas team. So that will also be a really strong one, and we'll be sending out information about future sessions soon. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Kim.
Thank you, Alicia. Welcome to the first Life Science webinar of 2022. And with that, I say Happy New Year. So today we are joined by BoB Biomechanics, who were founded in 2016 by Dr. Barbara May and Dr. James Shippen. So BoB Biomechanics is a biomechanical modeling software solution. Dr. James Shippen has a PhD from the University of Birmingham, and his research focused on structural, acoustic, finite element analysis, and has spent the subsequent 20 years in the field of biomechanical mathematical modeling. James will be presenting the BoB Biomechanics platform within the various applications and use cases. And this webinar will focus mainly on BoB teaching, which is a new application showcasing biomechanical principles and can be used as a teaching and learning resource. Without further ado, over to you, James.
Thank you very much indeed, Kim. Thank you, and thank you to all the delegates who have attended. As Kim mentioned, what I'd like to start with is a basic introduction to BoB biomechanical analysis. The heart of the BoB package is a human musculoskeletal model. Therefore, almost by definition, we've got within the model a representation of the human skeleton. The skeleton consists of 36 by default rigid segments connected by 34 joints. The skeleton itself can easily be scaled based on just overall height and overall mass, or the individual dimensions of the various segments can be individually edited, as can the inertia tensors for the segments. And the segments are joined by joints that represent their anatomical counterparts. I started off by saying it's a musculoskeletal model, so therefore we've also got a muscular model within BoB. Again, by default, we've got over 100 muscle units within the BoB model. They're modeled as Hill's 3 muscle elements. But what we can also do is we can include wrapping. So the muscles can wrap around the underlying skeletal structure, and one muscle can wrap around a more deep muscle within the model. And the muscles are easily edited by the muscle editor that's embedded within BoB. So a muscle can be added, modified, and deleted. Its insertion, its origin, its wrapping points can be easily modified to suit the user requirements. The BoB model will have to be articulated in some manner or another. It's going to have to be moved. The way it's moved can be various. About most simple is simply to state what the articulation of a joint is with the lookup table, for example, or maybe with the goniometer. Whilst this is useful for very simplistic examples, in fact, we're going to be seeing some of those later, it's fairly limited. Obviously, what we tend to do is use motion capture, and of course, the best is Vicon. So we can take optical tracking data, for example. BoB is configured by default to use the Vicon plug-in gate marker set, and that can either be full, by which I mean full body, or reduced, by which I mean we don't need the ones on the thigh and the shin and the upper arm and the lower arm. We actually use the kinematics of the joints themselves to calculate the joint axes, which means we get a very convenient marker set, which is very quick and easy to apply. BoB can also be driven by IMU data, for example, Vicon Blue Trident. There's a very robust and easy interface, and I've just got a poll. Bear with me a second. Move that out of the way. Can we go back to that? There we go. He's moving again. Sorry, go away. BoB can be driven by IMU data, which therefore includes all of the obvious advantages of acquiring by IMUs. Another input into BoB is forces, external forces that are acting on the body. So if you're working in an environment, for example, with force plates, BoB can take in the force plates and apply those to the body. Or if you've got force transducers anywhere on the within the laboratory, BoB can take in that data and apply those forces to the body. BoB can also take in video input, so you can synchronize the video to the motion captured data. This tends to be done just as almost as an aid memoir rather than an actual analysis tool, but it's very handy to say, okay, well, did the subject have shoes on or whatever? When all of this input has been put into the BoB model, what BoB can then do is go into inverse dynamics mode to calculate the torques at the joints and the forces of constraint across the joints as well. BoB has built into it a optimization routine that, given a cost function, by default we use the sum of the squares of the muscle activations, it can reduce or find a minimum, should I say, for that cost function, and the minimization of that cost function we associate with the muscle force distribution across the body. And this particular illustration, if it moves, there we go, the forces within the muscles are shown as color-coded. So the redder the muscle, the harder the muscle's working. BoB also contains a reasonably sophisticated graphics engine, and all of the little vignettes that are within this presentation have been generated by that graphics engine. Okay, so what kind of output can we get from BoB, having put all this in and done a bit of number crunching? About the most simplistic is tools to aid the visualization and the understanding of the motion that we're capturing. So this can be done in a number of ways. In this video, we're showing with the red and the yellow lines, their trajectories of the hands, for example. But what we're also showing are the instances of the subject. I think this is every half second as it goes through the motion. So it's just a way of understanding what's happening in your trial. What we can also display are the range of motions of the joints. This is showing the flexion extension of the right shoulder, but obviously it can be any joint and in any direction. The transparent blue is the region of the disc where the joint doesn't go. The red and the green shaded areas show the range of motion of the joint. It's also color coded in terms of time. So the joint is spending the most time in the red area and spending the least time in the green area. In all of these videos, we're showing whole body, but BoB can show a subset of the joints and the muscles and the segments within the body as required by the user. So obviously in this example, we're just showing the pelvis and the right leg. Force plates are always good, but they're small, they're expensive, they're hard. Sometimes using force plates is inappropriate, or you simply don't have them. In which case, what we can do is we can use BoB to calculate the ground reaction force by consideration of the acceleration of the center of mass and a consideration of the angular momentum of the body to calculate the split between 2 foot stance, so we can get the distribution of the force from one foot to another. BoB will also calculate the torques that's occurring at the joints that correspond to the observed motion and external forces. So in this particular example, we're showing what the torque is being generated at the shoulder and the lumbar region of the back, as we've got a vertical force on the right hand as the hand is flexed and extended. You can also see that it's affecting the ground reaction force as well, as shown by the yellow arrows, and that is all from internal calculations. As I mentioned a second ago, BoB can calculate the muscle forces across the body subject to the cost function being a reasonable representation of how the body is distributing the force. In this illustration, just to show, it's a part of a study that we did with the Tennis Association. We've attached a virtual camera to the pelvis, so the pelvis appears not to be moving. It's as if we put a camera on the pelvis, and we're looking at the loads around the lumbar region of the back. And again, the more active the muscle is, the redder it's shown, and if it's blue, the muscles aren't particularly active. If we know what the forces in the muscles are, and we know what the force of constraint within the joint are, we can calculate the joint contact force. And that's what we've done here with the red arrow in the lumbar region, and we've got a green arrow at one of the shoulders, the double-headed arrow. So that is giving a representation of the joint contact force. Over towards the right-hand side, we've plotted out those joint contact forces. Obviously, all of the data that we acquire from BoB can be dumped out as tabulated data, or it can be plotted as we've shown here and with a synchronized cursor. Those are obviously plots of variables against time. What we can also do is plot variable against arbitrary other variable for a phase plot. So in this particular example, we've got, what is it? It's the torque at the joint against the angle of the joint. But as I say, any variable can be plotted against any other variable. We can also analyze multiple subjects. BoB itself doesn't have a limitation on the number of subjects. So here we've got 8 people doing a jumping test, and we're comparing the kinematics and the kinetics of that particular task. BoB is written totally within MATLAB, and it can operate within the MATLAB environment. It can also be obtained as a standalone executable, so you do not need a MATLAB license to run BoB. Having said that, if you are a MATLAB user and you're very familiar and comfortable in that environment, it means you can introduce a musculoskeletal model into that environment. Okay, that is, in 10 minutes, a very brief overview of some of the capabilities of BoB. What I want to go on to now is just show some examples of uses that BoB has been put to by either ourselves or some of our users. BoB is quite extensively used in sports. It's been used, obviously, in tennis quite extensively, rugby, archery, football, baseball, basketball, sprinting, long jump, high jump, and golf are some of the ones that we know it's being used for. Another one is weightlifting. The reason I've put that in is because the forces within the joints and in the muscles are extremely sensitive to positions. So a very small change in position dramatically affects the loading within the muscles and within the joints. Obviously, the same can be said. Weightlifting is a natural extension onto Irish dance. We've worked with probably the premier Irish dance company in the world. They were experiencing a number of injuries, and what they were interested in is, being good employers, how to reduce that injury rate within their dancers. What's being shown at the moment is a step movement called the rock, where it looks horrendous, and it is, and we analyze this using Vicon equipment and BoB, and we found that within the ankle joint, we're getting about 14 times body weight occurring. which raises the question, how on earth does anybody survive it? What we also found is by very minor modifications to the choreography, so don't go over quite as far, we could dramatically reduce the joint contact forces. The change in choreography was so small that anybody in row B and back would not notice it. But in terms of the loads within the body, it was had a dramatic effect and hopefully will increase the career span of their dancers. BoB's also being used by a German company that manufactures horticultural equipment. What they're interested in is the inertia properties primarily of their equipment to try and reduce the fatigue of the people that are using the equipment. So they're trying to trim a hedge high up like that. How can we modify the torques that are occurring across the body by subtly shifting the center of mass location and the inertia properties of their tools? BoB's also being used in the design of automotive seats. This is a study that was done with a major American company who make automotive seats. What they're interested in is improving the comfort of ingress and egress of the vehicle, particularly for the elderly. So this biomechanical study is a part of a larger study that looked at the comfort levels and tried to come up with a model such that you could predict the comfort of ingress and egress for the vehicle by breaking it down into its constituent modes. BoB's also been used around the world by the emergency services. It's been used in Spain. Their police force are using it to develop their training techniques for police officers who are restraining people who would rather not be restrained. It's also being used by the British Fire Service. They're looking at new methods of extracting people from crashed vehicles. They're particularly interested in cervical and lumbar spinal movements. So whether they should use cervical collars, for example, and what the extraction routes should be. And that's about to be published. This is an example of work that was done by a Formula One team. So in this particular example, you've got 12 people that are replacing 4 tyres in groups of 3 people in under 2 seconds on a Formula One car. We measured the movement of each person within the team around the car and in other members that actually don't work within the pit stop, and they were looking for the optimal performance. Once they've established what the optimal performance is, they can then use this data to inform the other members of the team where they're going wrong and how to improve their performance. And that was very successful. The team that we did this with recorded the fastest pit stop of last year. BoB itself comes in 4 variants. There's BoB Research, BoB Ergo, BoB EMG, and BoB Teaching. BoB Research is really the core BoB system. Everything that we've seen so far is BoB Research. So you've got the inverse dynamic solver, you've got the muscle optimization force, and you've got all the graphics engines. All of that is core to BoB. What we've then done is we've put on ancillary analysis devices. So for example, BoB Ergo has specific functionality that's relevant to ergonomic analysis. So in there, we've coded in some ISO standards, NIOSH standards, Reba rulers in there, calculate cumulative loads and cumulative torques, and Maris risk factors are also in there. We can also take in EMG data into BoB. Most of the illustrations we've had so far, the muscle color coding was based on the internal BoB calculations of the muscle forces. That's different in this example. Those aren't internal calculations that are coloring those muscles. Those are actual EMG readings. what had been shown over on the right-hand side of the screen. So it's very handy for the visualization of the muscle activity. The particular variant that I want to speak about today is BoB teaching. This is fundamentally different to the other variants of BoB in that this is specifically designed for teaching students with identified sports science students, engineering, kinesiologists, physiotherapists, the students that have a vested interest in understanding how the body works and what the forces and torques that are occurring within the body are. BoB teaching contains all of the analysis capabilities and all the graphics of BoB research, but it can't import new data. What it does instead is it's preloaded with 20, at the moment, examples of trials. And what I'll do is actually go through those 20 to show what's actually embedded within there. What it means is that students can investigate by themselves, there's a very short learning curve, and look into how the body acts. They can ask questions in terms of the biomechanics within the body. It's priced at a position where what we want to do is make sure that every student has access to in-depth biomechanical analysis. Within the BoB teaching package, we also have many instructional videos, so the students can find their way around the functionality of BoB. It's also contained some editable student worksheets. So if you want to, as an instructor, literally just take it out of the box and say, there you go, that's an example of a worksheet, work your way through that, that's fine. But what we found in our trials is what a lot of instructors do is they take the template and they edit it to suit their own particular style and where they want to place the emphasis in terms of the biomechanics, and that's great. So some examples of the activities that are within BoB teaching. We start off at about the most simple case possible, that of a static hand load. And what I've shown here is just an example of the worksheet that's related to this particular activity. So here we've got somebody arm straight out in front of them with a vertical load being applied to the hand. What BoB can do is work out obviously what the torque is in there and what the muscle forces and what the ground reaction forces are. Being such a simple case, what it means is that the student can replicate that calculation by hand. They can calculate what the torque at the shoulder should be, and yes, there it is, that corresponds to that. They can work out remote torques as well. They can work out ground reaction forces for this particular example, just to get confidence in terms of applying biomechanical principles to a full body human system. And just to be reassured that it's not magic that's happening, you can apply Newton, Lagrange to a machine that happens to be a person just as much as you can to a robot. We then take it slightly more complicated. We've still got the extended arm with the vertical force, but now the arm is going through abduction and adduction. But again, it still lends itself to hand calculations and investigation. From these kind of trials, you can see how the torque rotates as the shoulder rotates, for example. You can see how the muscle forces change throughout the body as the muscle forces move. You can see how the ground reaction forces change as the torque at the shoulder changes, for example. What I must emphasize is that what I'm showing today are videos, but BoB teaching is not a collection of videos. It's the full-blown musculoskeletal model with 3D viewer. And so the student can go in there and they can play with that and they can investigate it and look at it from any particular direction and slice it open to really get involved with the particular activity. Moving on, slightly more complicated again. We introduced the concept of inverse dynamics. So here we've got a person that's swinging the hip in flexion extension, and we raise the question of, okay, what happens to the torque at the hip? as the frequency increases. And lo and behold, you find that the torque at the hip is a minimum at the natural frequency of the leg, as you'd pretty much expect. But what it's doing is introducing the concept of inverse dynamics to the student, and they can see it, and again, hopefully they can relate to it. And do simple hand calculations. What is the natural frequency of the leg? Oh yes, look, we've got a minimum torque at that particular frequency. We've now got our first example of motion capture, albeit fairly simply. So somebody is squatting. This was done with Vicon equipment in the lab. And what you can immediately see are the torques that are occurring around the body. And you can instantly see, okay, well, the torque, for example, in the hip versus the knee, they're acting in opposite directions. Didn't realize that. Fine. Again, it's totally visual. You can see it. You can get a feeling for what's happening. Slightly more, well, a lot more complicated. We go on to looking at gait. This is another example that's inbuilt within BoB teaching. For many examples, I can't remember off the top of my head how many, but a lot of them have also got EMG signals in there as well. So we've got obviously a gait pattern there. We've got the EMG signals. You can zoom in and examine the EMG signal in detail. On the video at the moment, we've got the muscle activations based on EMG being shown. It's being color-coded by the EMG signal, not the internal calculation. So it raises a question, okay, well, how good is the internal calculation? You can compare one against the other and look, and then investigate where the potential sources of error are, for example. Increasing the speed a little bit. Now our subject goes on to start jogging. We've chosen to make this video without the muscles on, but of course, if you want to turn the muscles on, you're perfectly willing to. We've used the discs to illustrate the range of motion of the joint through jogging. Obviously, you can do that with any other particular application you want. And again, it's color-coded, so you can see where the joint is throughout the trial, where it spends the most time, where it spends the least time, as well as the absolute limits of the articulation of the joint in any of the three rotational directions. If we've got gait and we've got jogging, we've obviously got to have running. So what it means that you can see how the loads in the body are changing as the demands on the body increase from walking through jogging into sprinting, running. So what you'll see, obviously, is an increase in the energy expenditure, which BoB also calculates, and the joint contact forces. Those go up as the level activity also increases. Balance and instability is another example. What we can see is how the centre of mass moves relative to the positioning of the foot. And what we can see is when the centre of mass actually goes outside the foot. So you've got a situation where the subject starts to topple. To what extent can the body cope with that movement of the centre of mass outside the zone of support? What happens when the centre of mass does go outside the zone of support? Well, what we know we'll see is that the subject start to fall over. And we can put on here as well visualization bars to emphasize the leaning over and how they're moving. Climbing stairs. What are the internal forces within the subject as they climb the stairs? This particular subject, they were just about to have a double knee replacement. And so what they're doing is guarding their knees. To what extent can they guard their knees to try and reduce the force that's in the knee joint as they climb and descend the stairs? What I didn't mention earlier is also on the student worksheet, they've got graphs for normative data. So you can say, okay, well, is this normative data or is it less than normative data? What's happening in the body? How's the subject behaving? Manual handling task. So what you've got is obviously somebody lifting a box, putting it on a high shelf, pick it up, pop it down again. And you can see that the muscles in the lumbar region of the back are flaring up. Okay, well, what's that doing to the intervertebral compression forces at that location. How many times body weight, for example, occurs during this fairly mundane task, and it's quite horrendous how much force you do have in there. What are the implications in terms of degenerative joint pathologies, for example, due to fairly mundane tasks? We've got an example which involves ballistics. So there's a subject that's actually going through a ballistic phase. It's also a fairly complicated ballistic phase. So you can look at the ballistics of the center of mass, which should be fairly parabolic, but you've then got all of the other segments that are combining to generate that fairly simple ballistic trajectory. The ballistics of the individual segments aren't particularly simple. How do they combine to generate a simple ballistic trajectory? Whilst on the subject of ballet, we've also got an example of angular momentum, almost the conservation of angular momentum, but you can start investigating, okay, what would the torque under the foot be? What's the change of angular momentum? And relate that to the torque that's occurring due to the friction between the foot and the floor. This is another example ripe for biomechanical analysis. Obviously, it's just somebody moving a wheelbarrow in a garden. But what we wanted to do with these examples is make them relatable. We wanted to get away from biomechanics is something that happens in a textbook. It isn't. Biomechanics happens in your back garden. And we want to move the analysis into the everyday environment such that somebody can take an everyday event, relate to it, start analysing it, start taking it apart, and start understanding what's happening within the body. Also got a couple of examples in there where people are interacting with equipment. So here we've got an arm curl machine. So obviously, as the elbow flexes, it raises the weight, so it's doing work. The muscles are doing work to generate the torque at the joint, but what the muscles are also doing is obviously increasing the joint contact force, as shown by the large double-headed red arrow. So again, analyze that, see what's happening, understand the situation. And just as we've got it for the arm, we've also got it for the knee as well. So a very similar occurrence, but subtly different, i.e. another limb, but lends itself to a similar style of calculation. A strange sport from the colonies. What we've got here is the trajectory of the throwing arm, right-handed picture. We're not just showing the trajectory. What we've done here is we've broken the path up into equal segments. So the red and the yellow, the trajectory changes color on a regular basis. So what you can get here is a feeling for when the maximum velocity is. We're also illustrating it with a velocity vector. You can put those anywhere you want on the body. But here raises a question, are they releasing the ball at the maximum velocity, for example? Again, it's an example where the students will relate to it, and they'll be able to, hopefully by now, start asking their own questions and investigating the subject. We're just giving them the data. And another example, again, cycling. This one also has the EMG together with the motion. One I laid over on this particular activity, which obviously you can do with any other activity. All I've done here is turned on the local coordinate systems for the segments. BoB can also show the local coordinate systems at the joints. So within biomechanical analysis, it's the movement of the local coordinates attached to the segments and their rotations in three-dimensional space that causes an awful lot of problems in terms of the analysis. Here, and indeed for all of these examples, you can look at the local coordinate systems and see how they move relative to each other. You can look at the joint coordinate systems. How do they behave? How does it look in terms of Euler angles, as opposed to what we call physio angles. What's wrong with abduction, adduction, flexion, extension, internal, external rotation? Where does it break down? What is gimbal lock? How often do you encounter gimbal lock? What's the way around it? These kind of questions can be asked as they've got examples of data that are exhibiting that kind of behavior. Rowing. Another example here, you can see the forces are being applied at the feet and the hands. We haven't included the force under the backside because that's doing no work. But what we're showing here, what I haven't mentioned, is we're labeling the muscles. So if in BoB you just right click on a particular muscle, you can get it to label what that muscle is. What this means is you can see where rectus femoris runs during this particular activity, for example. You can get a feel for what all those individual muscles are doing. And obviously, with the right click again, you can instantly plot out what the force in the muscle is, for example, what its extension is, what its contraction rate is. All of that is, we find useful for somebody that's learning anatomy, let alone all the engineering side. Again, just another example of data that were collected. This is somebody undertaking a tennis serve. So calculate the energy expenditure, whatever you want. And finally, another random sport. So here we've got somebody shooting basketball. Again, all of the tools that we've mentioned so far are applicable to this example. You can display the coordinate system, you can see muscle length, you can see torques at the joint sector, you can see energy expenditure. Compare the energy expenditure of a basketball shot to gate, for example, per unit time. Whatever you want to, the data's there, it's available. Let the students play, let them investigate. So in a nutshell, basically, I've given you an overview of BoB and focused in a bit on BoB teaching. So in summary, BoB is a human musculoskeletal model with all of the graphics engines and the analysis engines wrapped around it into a single standalone package. BoB teaching is subtly different in that has all of these examples built into it, so that it's can be used as a teaching tool. The students can be let loose on it and get on with it and investigate. We've got 20 preloaded activities in there at the moment. We're always adding to it. I think Vicon are about to let me loose on a certain number of trials that they've got in their bank, and we can slot those into BoB teaching as well. So the 20 will always increase. If you want any more information as regards to BoB teaching or any of the BoB derivatives, can I please encourage you to go to our website, which is bob-biomechanics.com, and all of the information is on there. Obviously, if you want anything else, ask us a question or send us an email. But for now, that's it. Thank you very much indeed. And back to Kim, I believe.
Thank you, James, for a great presentation. I can see we've had quite a lot of interest because the chat and QA is crawling with questions. So I'm going to get started in a particular order.
Okay.
The first question is, what kind of EMG for integration?
Yes, good question. I must say we do like Delsys equipment. We've got a very strong interface into Delsys. BoB can read HPF files generated by Delsys. Having said that, BoB also reads CSV files generated by any EMG equipment that can write CSV files. So it's a trivial format, which is it's easily available. It is literally just the name of the muscle and the columns of the EMG data. BoB will read that in. It will then do exactly what was shown there. We will color code the muscles on the moving skeleton, and you can plot the EMG signals there and then. What I didn't say is we can also plot out the rectified signal as well.
So this kind of follows on from previous question. How do you compare EMG data with estimated activation of muscles?
Well, that's again a very good question. In the worksheet template within BoB teaching, that is exactly one of the questions. It said, okay, well, we've taken this assumption, go and find out. The answer is, well, a partial answer is what we do by default is we have the cost function for the optimization of the sum of the squares of the activations of the muscles. We've gone for that because searching the literature, there is a reasonable case that that is a reasonable cost function. There's a lot of reasonables in there. I hate to say it, but we know it's false. But it's one of the best we've got so far. It's trivial to change the order of that polynomial. For example, you could put the order of the polynomial up to a very large number, and then it becomes effectively a minimax problem. You can put it to and you've got computational overheads for that. You can put it to just a higher order index than squared, and you can see what the effect of that is. But MATLAB users can actually put in their own individual cost function that they want. All that we will say as a formal answer is what we do is we calculate the minimum of the cost function, which is by default the sum of the squares of the muscle activations. Is it right? No, it's not right. Is it the best you've got out there at the moment? It probably is. If you've got something better, we can put it in, we can try it, and we can see how it works. But I would contest that nobody has the best function at the moment. Sorry, not the best, the ideal, the correct function at the moment. As soon as you do, we can pop it straight into BoB and use it. But until it is widely established what the correct function is, we will use a reasonably low order polynomial.
That's great. So the next question is there a way to trial the teaching software to see firsthand how it works? Definitely.
If anybody would like to go to our website, bob-biomechanics.com, in there, you've got to fill in a little form, you've got to work for it, but you can download a trial version of it. Would actually come over as BoB teaching, but you've got all the functionality in there. The reason we do it that way of sending out BoB teaching is because it's got all of these examples in there, so you can give it a really good thrashing around to find out how it works.
That's great. The next question is, how fast is the pipeline to import and process data? I think this is probably more of a BoB research question, the BoB teaching.
It is. It reads various formats. It likes the Vicon flavor of C3D. BoB at the moment is not real time. We are looking into real time. Somebody won't like me saying this, but so far we have not placed emphasis on real time for biomechanical analysis because one of us thinks you rarely actually use real time biomechanics, but that's an internal part of friction. How fast is the pipeline? That's a good question. I do not know what the reading rate of it is. The solution rate to do a full body muscle calculation for the muscle force distribution on this i7 takes about 0.2 of a second. So we're running at about 5 frames per second. But as I say, generally, it's not run in real time. I would say it runs fast. It takes 0.2 of a second to calculate the full body muscle force distribution. If you're not interested in muscle forces, BoB can do all of the inverse dynamics calculations, for example, in under 1/10 of a second. So it's somewhere between 1/10 of a second and 1/5 of a second.
Perfect. I'm sure if they have any follow-up questions, they'll go to you.
Totally, yeah, absolutely.
The next one is, can BoB do the forward dynamics?
No. Sorry, that is also on our to-do list. Yeah, we acknowledge that it's on there. I can't give a release date, but we are looking into it at the moment. We know how to do it, but we haven't done it. But brutally, the answer to the question is no.
So that's kind of a hot tip of future things to watch out for BoB updates.
Very much so. Yeah, we've got two major projects at the moment. We've got real time and we've got forward dynamics. We're working on both of them at the moment.
So the next question is, you showed some of the cases which have to consider interaction forces between human and environment. However, generally it's difficult to measure these interactions forces. How does BoB consider these interactions of forces?
It's exactly as the question asker said, it needs to be measured. And I acknowledge that it is difficult. In the examples that we had, it lends itself very well to calculation. So the arm curl and the leg extension, we know what the mechanism is, we know what the masses are. Using the motion tracker, we've got the acceleration, so we can calculate reasonably what the contact forces are. Even for the likes of the wheelbarrow, we can pretty much calculate what the handle forces are. For something more complex, it would have to be measured or estimated. But yeah, I'm afraid BoB can cope with it. It's a matter of it needs to be measured. And I acknowledge that's non-trivial.
So this one's more a question, I think it's probably a lecturer speaking on behalf of their students. Can students purchase a teaching copy on their own? Would you consider an order directly from individual students? Of course, there are currently 42 students. I guess this is probably more of a question following up offline. Yeah,
so you said there's currently what, 42 students, did you say?
Yeah, 42 students.
We typically don't sell it to individual students. Not make us an offer. Generally, what we do is we've got prices for 10-seat licenses, 20-seat licenses, and unlimited license. So if you've got 42, it will be very economical to get an unlimited license. A single student, not really. That's not really how it's intended to be. They could buy a 5-seat license. Contact us and we'll see what we can do, but that is not the emphasis of BoB teaching.
The next question, it's not really a question actually, it's just more of a statement, hoping for some prosthetic and orthotic examples with a winky face. So I think that's just more the looking forward to seeing more showcases. Totally. So something to think about for future. The next question is from YouTube. So are we able to create our own data and map it for examples? That is a question.
You can use your own data within everything but BoB teaching. So yeah, we've got very strong interfaces to Vicon, but BoB teaching is the strange one. It's the outlier. That is a closed box. What we want people to do is to try using BoB teaching almost as a start, and then go on to say, oh, well, great, we can do all of this within biomechanics. Let's go out and buy a Vicon, and we'll then use that. It's almost an appetite whetter, and also it's a primer for biomechanics. It's intended as that kind of tool.
That's great. Do you check different cost functions to find best compatible between estimated and measured activation?
We do. We spent a lot of time on that. Yeah, I would love to say, yeah, it's a fourth order. That's what you want to be doing. It's not as easy as that. You have different indices work better for different activities. I can put you or anybody point them towards a direction of various papers that say the squared of the activation works well. That's what we use by default. But as I say, it's absolutely trivial for the user to change it to the 5th order, to the 20th order, to whatever. The only downside of that, as I say, it computationally it requires much less resource if it's a quadratic, but obviously that's not a good enough reason to use a quadratic. But it is, if your 5th order is behaving no better than your 2nd order or quadratic, use the quadratic. The answer to the question is yes, we've looked into many cost functions. We have not found the silver bullet yet. If somebody does, we would be absolutely delighted, and we will bring it very swiftly into BoB. But until then, we're using by default the sum of the squares of the activations, which we have evidence works reasonably well.
The next question is, will this webinar video record to the YouTube channel for Vicon? Yes, it will be. So Alicia will finish off her statement with that. So all of you attending right now will get an email with the recording link tomorrow. It should be live on YouTube from tomorrow onwards. Next question. There's quite a lot of EMG questions. How to sync the motion and EMG in BoB if I have a motion and EMG file?
No, sorry, once more.
How do you sync the motion and EMG in BoB if I have a motion and EMG file?
I am embarrassed. Sorry. How does the motion and the EMG file?
Sync in BoB. So I think it's a synchronization.
How does it sync? Sorry, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry, I apologize. Absolutely. Yeah, a very good question for the third time. It depends on BoB. BoB doesn't natively sync them. What BoB will do by default is it will assume that they are synced externally. So it will say, by assumption, that the EMG and the motion are already synced. Having said that, what you can do is you can introduce a time shift if you've got some key in there, if somebody jumps up and down. That's very much a back foot arrangement. What we'd rather have is the signals coming in synced. If they're coming in synced, bang, yeah, you've got it. Use an external trigger somewhere. If you don't have that, you can time shift within BoB, but it is much, much better to use an external sync between the motion and the EMG.
Great. Next question. You said BoB can use accelerations to calculate reaction forces without force plates. In gait analysis, for example, how do you calculate the reaction force on each leg in double stance?
Yeah, absolutely. We use a consideration of the momentum. So what we'll say, we know where the locations of the forces are from the motion data. What we then do is we consider the torques that are being generated as a difference between those ground reaction forces, and we equate that to the change in angular momentum of the subject. So if we know what the change in angular momentum is, so that's for the dynamic. In the static, obviously just the positioning of the center of mass, you can calculate what the torque is as a difference between the forces on the ground reaction forces. So if that makes sense, by consideration of the position of the center of mass and the consideration of the change in angular momentum, we can calculate what the torque being applied to the subject is, and we assume that the torque being applied to the subject is due to the difference in the ground reactions of the feet, and we know what the total ground reaction force is by the linear acceleration of the center of mass.
That's great. We've got so many questions, so I'm going to just do a couple more, and then we'll obviously let everyone contact BoB afterwards. But sure. How many degrees of freedom of lower limb can be analysed by BoB during dynamic analysis?
Totally. Let's count them. So for the lower limb, we use at the moment just a paddle foot. We've got the lower limb and we've got the upper limb. So if we assume that the 6 degrees of freedom in each, we've got 18 degrees of freedom. Obviously, the joints will remove the 3 translational degrees of freedom at each joint. The degrees of freedom at the knee is a good question. We can go anywhere up to releasing 3 degrees of freedom at the knee. So therefore, yeah, we've got the full varus valgus, internal external rotation, flexion extension at the knee, and we can do the same at the ankle. What I haven't mentioned so far is we have a file called the skeleton file, and that defines the skeleton mechanism. Within there, you can define how many degrees of freedom are released at each of these joints. So you can turn, for example, if you wanted to, the ankle into a simple hinge, or you can have it with some pronation, supination if you want to. So the answer to the question is it is user defined. They can change the number of degrees of freedom that are released by the joints. Well, not obviously, but you can't release translational degrees of freedom at the joints. Your leg can't fall off.
Next one is to do with BoB Ergo. Do you
Yes.
need BoB Ergo to include other objects, such as in the tennis example and weightlifting example, or is BoB EMG capable of doing the same?
So BoB Ergo or BoB EMG, was that?
So it's actually a question, but I think what they're asking is for them wanting to use BoB EMG, can you also get objects within there, or do you need BoB Ergo variant as well?
It comes back to the previous question in terms of contact forces. MATLAB users have got full access to all of handle graphics within MATLAB. So the arm extension, the arm curl, even the basketball, all of that was done in MATLAB graphics. So you can display the objects, but that's not what the question is asking. The question is asking about the interaction. That then comes back to the previous question about the contact forces. The way BoB interacts with its surrounding is via external forces. If you can measure those external forces, yes, you can get BoB interacting with them, but as we've previously said, that's a big if, and for many conditions, it's a non-trivial-ish if. If you know what those external forces are, BoB can interact. That holds true for all of the BoBs. So EMG, Ergo, all of them come back to the problem of the external contact forces. If those can be established, it means you can put those into whichever you want. So for example, if you're doing a BoB Ergo analysis of somebody moving an object, what you would have to do is calculate the external force that's acting on the limb. From then on, BoB will take over and it will do a complete ergonomic analysis of it, but you do need that external force for all BoBs.
Great. I'll just do 2 more questions and then we're going to unfortunately have to call it. There's just so many questions. Can we import trajectory data to BoB in plug-in gate format, or should we import only in motion of joints?
Oh, I never thought of importing trajectories. That's a good question. Yeah, so the answer is no. I'm trying to think how you would do it. So you'd almost have to do an inverse kinematics to calculate the joint angles. If you can do the inverse kinematics outside BoB, you can trivially import then the joint angles into BoB that will recreate the trajectory. Doing that inverse kinematics is not that bad. We've done it in a development project that we did with BoB many years ago. But it all comes down to, I'm afraid I'm going to have to throw back to the user. You've got to do an external inverse kinematics to go from trajectory to joint angles, then bring it into BoB as joint angles, then plot the trajectory, and you should get the number you first thought of. That's
great. And last question, I'm sorry if I haven't asked any of the questions that you're interested in, who are attending. This is to do with scientific papers. Is there any scientific papers available using BoB as a showcase?
Oh, yes. So throughout the development process, we've been publishing throughout. So if anybody is interested in the background papers, please just drop us a line, and we've got a list of publications that BoB is based on.
Well, that's great. Apologies to everyone. There's so many questions coming in. So if you're still interested in the answer, please contact BoB directly, and I'm sure James will be more than happy to answer those questions. A lot of questions are asking compared to other musculoskeletal modeling applications. So,
there are any others?
Yeah, so Alicia, just over to you just to end the session, and thank you everyone for listening.
And thank you.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you, James. And we do have plenty of questions. Thank you guys for submitting those. Like Kim said, you can send them to the BoB team. If you have any questions for Vicon, you can contact us here, sales@Vicon, info@Vicon. If you're interested in collaborating with us on a session, you can always email me at marketing@vicon.com. The session is live now on our YouTube channel. So youtube.com/Vicon, you can find it and share it. I'll also be putting it on all of our social channels right after this. And then you'll receive the video recording to the email you registered with tomorrow. So 24 hours after the session started. So I think that will do it. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.